It began at dawn, when the sky was still soft and pale and the neighborhood was quiet enough to hear the first birds waking up, and he stepped outside with a cup of coffee in his hand, expecting a peaceful morning, but instead froze mid-step because the ground around his house looked wrong, torn in strange shapes, uneven like something had crawled through the dirt during the night, carved like a wound around his home, and when he walked closer, his heart slammed inside his chest because the truth hit him fast and sharp. A long trench, deep, messy, freshly dug, circled his entire property in a perfect loop, as if someone wanted to trap him inside, cut him off, mark him, threaten him, and this wasn't a utility trench or construction work or anything normal. This was sabotage, this was personal. This was someone trying to send a message, and when he turned his head slowly, he saw them, the HOA board members standing across the street in a neat little group, whispering, smirking, trying to look innocent but failing badly because the shovels leaning against their legs still had wet dirt on them and the ground near their shoes was marked with the same mud that now surrounded his property. And they stared back at him like predators waiting for a reaction, waiting to see if their plan worked, waiting to see fear in his eyes, and when he walked toward them, still shocked, still unable to understand how far they had gone, the board president crossed her arms and gave him a fake smile, the kind that always meant trouble, and he asked in a calm voice why they dug around his house, why they destroyed his yard, why they thought this was acceptable, and she smirked and said, "Maybe now you'll follow the rules." In a tone cold enough to freeze air, and his blood turned cold because he lived alone, he paid every fee, he followed every regulation, he kept his yard sharp, his fence clean, his mailbox painted. He did everything right, and still they came after him like he was the enemy, and the more he looked at them, the more he realized something strange. They weren't nervous, they weren't scared, they weren't guilty, they were confident, they believed they were untouchable, as if they owned him, as if they controlled everything in the neighborhood, as if digging a trench around someone's home was just another day in their routine. But they forgot something important, something they never imagined would matter, and that was the cameras he had, carefully placed in his yard, not just simple cameras stuck on walls, but hidden lenses buried under soil, tucked inside birdhouses, disguised in porch lights, and placed where no one would ever think to look because months ago he sensed that the HOA was watching him too closely, inspecting him too often, treating him differently, and his instincts told him trouble was coming, so he prepared quietly, secretly, smartly, and now those cameras had captured everything, the first shovel breaking the ground at 2:47 a.m., the board members working in the dark like thieves, the whispered arguments, the laughter when someone said, "Let's dig deeper. Make it look like a real trench." The moment they kicked dirt toward his property line, the moment the president said, "He thinks he can ignore us? He'll learn." And every second of their illegal, childish, dangerous stunt was recorded in perfect clarity. And when he realized that, a small calm settled over him, not relief, not happiness, but the calm a person feels when they know the enemy has just destroyed itself without realizing it. And he slowly backed away from the HOA group, ignoring their taunts, ignoring their smirks, ignoring the way they looked at him like he was prey, and he went back inside his house, shut the door behind him, locked it gently, walked to his office and opened the video feed, and when the first recording played, he felt something heavy inside him break. Not fear, not anger, but disappointment, deep and painful disappointment, because he had lived here for years, quietly, peacefully, minding his own business, helping neighbors when they asked, paying dues on time, attending meetings, being fair, being patient, and still the HOA chose him to target, chose him to bully, chose him to break. But they didn't know him, not really. They didn't know the history he carried, the patience he learned growing up, the quiet strength he built after losing people he loved. They didn't know he didn't fight with fists or threats. He fought with truth, logic, law, and evidence, and right now he had more evidence than any homeowner ever needed. And as he clicked through each camera angle, watching these people dig through his soil like criminals, hearing them brag about teaching him a lesson, something inside him hardened, something cold and strong, something determined, and he whispered to himself, "You made a mistake." Because now it wasn't just about a trench, it wasn't just about property damage, it wasn't just about harassment. It was about power, control, bullying, and abuse, and he had proof of all of it, and the HOA had given it to him with their own hands. He copied the footage to 3 separate hard drives because he knew how HOA people acted when they realized they messed up. They panicked, they threatened, they tried to cover things up, they pretended to be innocent, they blamed the homeowner, they tried to destroy evidence, But he was smarter than that. He always had backup plans, always prepared for the worst, and he hid one hard drive in the attic, placed another in his truck under a floor panel, and slipped the third into a locked drawer in his garage, and then he sat back and breathed deeply, letting the quiet morning settle around him as he thought about what to do next, how to move, how to respond, and he realized he had two options. Confront them with anger like they wanted, or stay silent and let them dig their own graves deeper. And he chose silence because silence scared bullies more than shouting ever did. Silence made them nervous. Silence made them reveal more than they meant to. Silence made them act stupid. And the HOA was about to act very, very stupid. He stepped outside again, pretending to be shaken, pretending to be confused, pretending to be defeated, and the board members watched him like vultures, whispering things to each other as they leaned on their shovels, as if waiting for him to break, waiting for him to snap, waiting for him to give them the reaction they wanted. But instead he quietly walked to his car, drove away, and didn't say a single word to them, and the board president frowned because that wasn't the reaction she expected. She wanted him angry. She wanted him scared. She wanted him emotional. She wanted him unstable so she could label him dangerous in the next meeting. But instead he left calm, and that calm scared her more than she admitted. When he reached town, he made two stops. First at the hardware store to buy soil sample bags, measuring tape, and a cheap handheld scanner. Then at the county office where he requested the land survey documents for his property. And the clerk didn't ask questions because the request was normal, legal, routine, but inside him something was building. Something sharp and controlled, like a plan forming piece by piece. A plan that didn't just involve the trench but the entire HOA structure. And when he drove back home, the trench looked even more ridiculous in daylight. A childish ring of dirt meant to intimidate him but instead serving as the biggest piece of self-inflicted evidence the HOA could have created. He walked around it slowly, like he was inspecting the damage, but inside he felt a strange mix of anger and calm, because he knew how this story would end, and it wouldn't end with him buried under HOA fines. It would end with them standing in front of a judge, watching their own recorded actions ruin their lives. He knelt by the trench, pretended to take pictures for his insurance, knowing the HOA was watching from behind their windows. Then he stood up, wiped dirt from his hands, and whispered to himself, "You wanted a war? Fine. But you forgot the cameras." And as the sun rose higher, shining across the torn soil and the quiet houses, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was only the beginning, and the HOA had no idea how badly they had just lost, for the rest of the day. He pretended nothing was wrong, moving through his house with calm steps even though inside him a storm was building, a mix of anger, hurt, betrayal, and a strange quiet strength that always rose when life pushed him too far. And while the HOA believed they had broken him, believed the trench around his home had scared him into silence, he spent his afternoon gathering every detail he needed, checking each camera angle, saving each clip twice, memorizing every face, every laugh, every threat whispered in the dark. And as he watched the footage again, emotions he hadn't felt in years stirred inside him. Sadness that people he once greeted with neighborly smiles had turned into bullies, frustration that the HOA treated homeowners like enemies instead of community members, a deep exhaustion that came from fighting battles he never asked for. And beneath all of it, a quiet, fierce fire that refused to let injustice win. When night fell, he turned off all his lights, sat by his window, and watched as the HOA president and two board members walked around the trench again, carrying clipboards, pointing at his yard, acting like they had authority carved into their bones, and even though they tried to whisper, his hidden microphones picked up everything. Their mockery, their insults, their plan to file more fake violations by morning, their excitement over pushing him to comply, their disgusting joy in seeing someone scared, and as he sat in the dark watching them, he felt something inside him harden in a way that wasn't anger but resolve. A resolve shaped not from revenge but from justice, because he knew he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for every silent homeowner who ever felt powerless under HOA abuse. When they left, he finally stood up and walked outside with a flashlight, moving slowly around the trench, letting the cold air settle his thoughts, feeling the quiet of the night wrap around him like armor. And he knelt by the edge again, touching the loose dirt, imagining how they laughed while digging it, imagining how confident they must have felt, imagining how they believed he would crumble under their pressure. But they didn't know his past. They didn't know the storms he survived before. Buying this home, They didn't know about the nights he slept on floors because life had knocked him down so hard he didn't know how to stand. They didn't know the losses he carried inside him. Losses far heavier than any trench could ever scare him with, and the more he remembered what he had survived, the smaller the HOA became in his mind, like annoying insects trying to sting a man who already walked through fire. He went back inside, locked the door, and finally allowed himself one deep breath, a breath filled with the heaviness of the day and the clarity of tomorrow's plan. Because this wasn't just a simple dispute anymore. This was targeted harassment, property destruction, intimidation, conspiracy, and he had enough evidence to bring the entire HOA system to its knees. That night he opened a folder on his computer labeled Emergency. A folder he hoped he would never have to use, and inside it were templates for legal letters, saved phone numbers of attorneys, state property codes, HOA laws, county regulations, and a list of rights that most homeowners didn't even know they had. Rights the HOA had been quietly violating for months, and as he read them again, the fire in his chest grew stronger because everything the board had done, every fake violation, every threat, every late-night trespass was illegal, and not just illegal but criminal. He typed slowly, carefully, creating a detailed file with timestamps, descriptions, and evidence from the cameras, each entry tightening his case like a rope around the HOA's neck. And when he was done, he leaned back and stared at the ceiling, letting the weight of the day settle into something powerful. Certainty. Certainty that they picked the wrong man. Certainty that the truth would destroy them. Certainty that he had the upper hand without raising his voice once. The next morning, the HOA struck again, placing a bright orange violation notice on his door that said, "Failure to maintain safe property conditions." And he couldn't help but laugh under his breath because the irony was too perfect. They created the unsafe condition and then blamed him for it, and as he took the paper off his door, he saw them standing by the street again, watching, pretending to be innocent protectors of the neighborhood. But their eyes were sharp and cold, waiting for him to explode, waiting for him to argue, waiting for him to make the mistake they needed to justify the trench, the harassment, the threats, and he simply nodded at them, calm as ever, and went back inside without saying a word. That silence terrified them. He could see it. They shifted uncomfortably, exchanged nervous glances, whispered among themselves, because silence meant he had something planned. Silence meant he wasn't defeated. Silence meant he was smarter than they thought. The board president even tried to follow him to the mailbox, pretending she wanted to clear misunderstandings. But he ignored her completely, walked past her like she didn't exist, and she stared at him with a mix of anger and fear, because for the first time she felt like the ground under her confidence was cracking. As soon as she left, he went to his garage, pulled out the hard drive, and placed it gently in his truck, ready for the next step. A step that would change everything. He wasn't taking the evidence to the HOA. He wasn't arguing with the board. He was taking it straight to the county office and then to a lawyer who specialized in HOA corruption cases. And when he closed his garage door and looked at the trench one last time before driving away, he whispered, "You dug this. Now you'll bury yourselves in it." And with that, he started the engine and drove away, calm, steady, ready, because this wasn't a tragedy for him. This was the beginning of their end. He drove to town with a calm face but a storm inside his chest, gripping the steering wheel harder every time he remembered the HOA president's smirk. The way they stood across the street like they owned the world, like the trench around his home was some kind of victory, some kind of punishment, some kind of message carved into the dirt to show him he was alone, powerless, surrounded. But they didn't know the truth. They didn't know he wasn't a man who broke easily. They didn't know he fought his battles quietly but smartly. They didn't know that every time life tried to crush him, he became sharper, colder, stronger, and by the time he reached the county office, he had already built the entire plan in his head like a map laid out across the dashboard. He walked inside, keeping his voice steady, asking for property damage forms and land encroachment reports, and the clerk, a tired elderly woman who had seen enough HOA drama for 10 lifetimes, looked at him for a long moment before saying softly, "It was them, wasn't it?" He nodded, and a sadness flickered across her face, like she had seen too many homeowners crushed under HOA abuse, too many people who didn't have the courage or the resources to fight back. But when she looked at him, she saw something different. She saw a man who wasn't afraid, a man who was prepared, a man who walked into this office not for help but for justice. She quietly handed him 3 forms instead of 1, saying in a low voice, "Take all of these. You'll need them." He thanked her, and when he stepped back outside, the sunlight felt different, stronger somehow, sharper, like the day itself knew that something big was coming. He got in his truck and drove to the attorney's office next, the one who specialized in HOA corruption cases, the one with a reputation so cold that most HOAs tried to settle cases before he even stepped into the courtroom. When he walked inside, the receptionist asked, "Do you have an appointment?" And he simply answered, "No, but you'll want to hear this?" And when he said HOA, her expression changed instantly. She motioned him toward a door, and within minutes he was sitting across from the attorney, a sharp-eyed man with a calm smile, the kind of smile that said he had destroyed many corrupt boards without breaking a sweat. The man listened quietly as he explained the trench, the harassment, the fake violations, the intimidation, and then he pulled out the hard drive and placed it on the desk with a soft thud, saying, "I have everything on video." The attorney leaned back slowly, eyebrows rising, and when he played the first clip, board members digging at 2:47 a.m., laughing, cursing, talking about breaking him. The attorney's smile faded into something darker, something colder, something dangerous for the HOA. "You just handed me the easiest case of my career," the attorney said, voice low, controlled, powerful. "They're done." Hearing those words made something inside him loosen. Not relief exactly, but a kind of emotional crack where the tension, fear, and anger had been sitting all night, and for the first time since he saw the trench that morning, he felt something like hope. They talked for almost an hour, planning step by step. Documentation, photos, soil samples, timestamps, matching footprints to HOA shoes, matching tools to the trench depth, using the HOA's own meeting minutes as evidence of intent, and with every plan, every strategy, every legal angle the attorney explained, the weight on his shoulders slowly lifted, replaced by a quiet fire burning inside his chest. When he left the office, everything felt different. Not the trench, not the HOA, not the neighborhood, but his own sense of power. For the first time since the HOA started targeting him months ago, he wasn't reacting, he was preparing. He wasn't scared, he was focused. He wasn't alone. He had the law, the truth, and the evidence on his side. When he returned home, he saw the HOA board president standing near his driveway again, pretending she was checking property lines. But he saw through her act instantly, saw the fear behind her eyes, fear she tried to hide behind fake confidence, fear caused by the silence she couldn't understand. She expected him to argue, to shout, to beg, but instead he walked past her with a calm smile and said nothing. That single moment, his silence, his lack of fear, shook her more than any words ever could. He went inside, placed the new documents on his desk, and then checked the cameras again. The new footage made his stomach twist. Not out of shock, but out of disappointment so deep it almost hurt. The HOA had come back during the afternoon when he was gone and stood around the trench laughing again, mocking him, calling him names, talking about sending more violations, bragging about scaring him, and he realized something heartbreaking. These people didn't just want control, they wanted cruelty. They enjoyed hurting him. They enjoyed watching him suffer. And that realization made everything clearer. This wasn't about rules. This wasn't about property. This wasn't about the community. This was about power. And people who crave power hate one thing more than anything else: losing it. So he decided to take everything from them, not out of revenge but out of justice, out of protecting the next homeowner they would target, out of making sure no one else had to wake up to a trench around their home. The emotional weight of the day pressed on him as he sat on his porch that evening, watching the sun set behind the houses, and he felt a strange mix of exhaustion and determination. He thought about his quiet life before all this, the peace he once had, the garden he worked on every weekend, the joy he felt when the wind moved through the trees his father helped him plant, and he realized that the HOA had tried to steal something far bigger than land. They tried to steal his peace, his safety, his dignity. And that was unforgivable. As night fell, he turned on the porch light and looked at the trench once more, feeling a cold promise form inside him. A promise shaped by everything he endured in the past, everything he fought through, everything life tried to take from him. "You tried to scare me," he whispered into the quiet night. "But you only woke up the wrong man." And inside his house, his phone buzzed. A message from his attorney. short but powerful. Everything is in motion. They won't see it coming. He smiled for the first time that day, a tired smile but a strong one, because now the story had changed. The HOA thought they started the war. They didn't realize he had just ended it. That night felt heavier than the others, as if the air itself carried the weight of everything the HOA had done, everything they had planned, everything they believed they could get away with. And as he sat inside his living room with only a small lamp glowing beside him, the house around him felt quieter than usual, almost listening, almost waiting, and he knew deep down that something inside him had changed forever. He wasn't just a homeowner dealing with petty harassment anymore. He had become someone who understood exactly how far people with a little power could go, and how dangerous they became when no one stopped them. When the clock hit 11 p.m., he checked the cameras again, not because he expected anything new, but because he knew the HOA wasn't done. They were angry, confused, restless, wondering why he hadn't argued or broken down or begged for mercy, and bullies always panicked when the person they targeted didn't react the way they expected. As the feed loaded, his breath caught for a moment because he saw movement. 3 figures sneaking back to his yard, flashlights pointed at the ground, whispering in urgent tones that his hidden microphones captured perfectly. It was the HOA board president, the vice president, and another board member, all standing at the edge of the trench, their faces tense, their voices low and sharp. "Why hasn't he fought back yet?" the vice president hissed. "Why is he so calm?" The president snapped. "Because he's scared. That's why. He'll break soon." But her voice didn't sound confident. It sounded shaky, like she was trying to convince herself, not the others. "We need to push harder," another whispered. "If he doesn't give in, we'll never get the developer's contract." And that moment, that exact sentence, hit him like a punch to the chest, not because it surprised him, but because it confirmed something he had suspected for weeks. They weren't just bullying him because they could. They were bullying him because they wanted something from him, something big, something worth risking everything for, and suddenly everything clicked into place like puzzle pieces snapping in perfect formation. His property wasn't just a house. It was land, strategic land, the biggest piece of property in the entire neighborhood, positioned perfectly for whatever project the developer wanted. And the HOA knew that as long as he lived here, as long as he refused to sell, as long as he didn't bow to their pressure, the deal would never happen, and they were willing to destroy him to make it happen. He leaned closer to the screen, watching as the president paced around the trench, her flashlight shaking slightly. "If he files a complaint, we deny everything," she muttered. "We say the trench was old. We say he dug it. We say he tampered with HOA markers." The vice president scoffed. "But what if he has cameras?" She froze. "He doesn't," she said quickly. "I checked his porch. There's nothing." "What about the yard? Who puts cameras in the yard?" she snapped. And he almost laughed in disbelief, because if there was one thing the HOA was good at, it was underestimating him. He watched as they circled the property, whispering, cursing, arguing about the next step, and each word fueled the quiet fire burning inside his chest. Not anger this time, but something deeper, something older, something colder. Resolve. Not the resolve to fight anymore, he was already fighting. This was the resolve to finish this, to end their corruption, to expose every single board member who thought their title made them untouchable. When they finally left, he saved the new footage, labeled it neatly under HOA Trespassing Night 2. Backed it up to the 3 drives again, and then sat down at his desk with his head in his hands, not because he was tired, but because the emotional weight of everything he had been holding inside finally cracked open. The sadness of being targeted for no reason, the stress of waking up every day wondering what they would do next, the fear of being alone against people who controlled everything in the neighborhood, the disbelief that adults could act this cruel, and the exhaustion of pretending to be fine while living under constant pressure. But beneath all that pain was something else, something stronger than fear. Determination. Determination to protect his home. Determination to fight for his dignity. Determination to make sure no one ever felt this helpless again. He stood up slowly, wiped his face, and went outside to breathe the night air. The trench looked deeper now, more dramatic in the moonlight, like a scar circling his home. A scar someone else had carved, but he would use as evidence to carve out justice. He walked its edge carefully, the cold dirt crunching under his shoes, and every step reminded him of the voice recordings, the threats, the laughter, the disrespect that now felt like fuel pouring into the fire growing inside him. "You think you buried me?" he whispered to the empty night. "But all you did was hand me the shovel to bury your lies." His phone buzzed suddenly. Another message from his attorney. "We'll file the first motion tomorrow morning. Be ready." He stared at the message, letting those words sink deep into him, letting the meaning wrap around him like armor. The next step was coming. The storm he had survived was nothing compared to the storm he was about to unleash. When he went back inside and locked the door behind him, his home felt different. Not like a place under attack, but like a fortress preparing for battle. He sat on his couch, stared at the ceiling, and took one deep breath, letting the silence fill him, letting the night steady him, letting the truth settle inside his bones. "They wanted me scared," he whispered. "But now, they should be." And as the house fell into quiet again, he knew something with absolute certainty. This wasn't the middle of the story. This wasn't the falling point. This was the rise, the moment where everything shifted, the moment where their confidence turned into fear, the moment where their control slipped through their fingers, the moment where he stopped being their victim and became their reckoning. And the HOA had no idea that the real fight had only just begun. The next morning arrived heavy and quiet, the kind of silence that feels like the world is holding its breath before something big happens, and as he stepped outside with tired eyes but steady hands, he saw the HOA president standing by the mailbox again, pretending to inspect community landscaping. Though her eyes kept darting toward his house with a nervous energy she couldn't hide, and he realized that his silence, his calm, steady silence, was eating at her more than any confrontation ever could. She expected anger, shouting, chaos, but instead she saw a man who walked past her without fear, a man whose shoulders didn't slump, a man who didn't ask questions or demand explanations, and that terrified her because people who stay quiet are either broken or planning, and she was starting to understand which one he was. He drove past her without saying a word and could see her stiffen in his rearview mirror, whispering something to the vice president who suddenly appeared behind her with a stack of papers that looked suspiciously like more violations. But he didn't stop, didn't look back, didn't let their presence disturb the calm storm building inside him because today was the day everything started falling into place. When he reached the attorney's office, the lawyer looked at him with a satisfied expression, already holding a folder thick with strategy, evidence, requests, and legal charges that would suffocate the HOA board as surely as a courtroom rope tightening around their lies, and together they finalized the motion. Destruction of property, intentional harassment, trespassing at night, reckless endangerment, coercion, attempted fraud, and conspiracy to remove a homeowner by force. Every word was backed by video proof, audio proof, timestamp proof, and physical proof, and each piece of evidence felt like a brick being added to a wall that would soon trap the HOA in their own corruption. When he left the office, the sun felt warmer on his face, not because the day had changed but because he wasn't scared of them anymore. He wasn't even angry. He was prepared, clear-minded, focused in a way that made him feel like he had stepped into a new version of himself, someone stronger, someone who no longer let others control his peace. When he returned home, he saw fresh orange cones blocking part of his driveway, and taped to his garage door was another violation notice. This one claiming his property lines were unclear. A laughable accusation considering the HOA was the one who illegally dug a trench around it. He didn't even tear the notice down, he simply filmed it, photographed it, and walked inside. The board members across the street watched him with wide eyes, confused by his calmness, mistaking it for defeat when it was actually the quiet before a storm they could not survive. He spent the afternoon gathering more evidence, measuring the trench depth, capturing soil samples, taking photos of HOA footprints still visible in the disturbed dirt, documenting every angle with steady hands and a patient heart because he knew each piece mattered. Each piece was a thread they had left dangling. Each piece was another nail in the coffin they built for themselves. Emotion curled inside him. Not helplessness like before, but a deep ache of exhaustion mixed with determination, because as he worked, he remembered the early days in the neighborhood, the friendly waves, the quiet mornings, the hope he had when he first bought the home, the belief that this place would finally bring peace, And the betrayal hit him like a slow bruise spreading across his chest as he realized how quickly that dream had been attacked, how easily people with a little power turned kindness into weakness and weakness into opportunity. But that emotion didn't drag him down. It pushed him forward, solidifying the promise he had made to himself. They would never do this to him again, and they would never do this to another homeowner again. Around sunset, when he stepped into his backyard to check the last camera angle, he heard something. The muffled sound of footsteps behind his fence, hurried whispers, the kind of shaky voices that told him the HOA was starting to panic, and when he checked the camera feed, his instincts were confirmed. The board members had gathered behind his backyard again, thinking they were out of sight, talking fast and scared, arguing about rumors spreading around the neighborhood that something big was coming, that he had gone to a lawyer, that they needed to cover their tracks. And the president, now visibly anxious, said, "We need to take control before he does. Tomorrow we'll start emergency violations. If he breaks one rule, we can push him into forced mediation." But her voice lacked the confidence it once had. It shook, cracked, slipped. They were unraveling. Their perfect masks were cracking. Their power was leaking through their fingers like water. And he watched all of it silently, recording every second, storing it away like a final gift they were handing him. Proof of conspiracy, proof of intent, proof of desperation. That night he stood on his porch again, staring at the trench glowing faintly under the moonlight, feeling a strange calm wash over him. A calm shaped by the knowledge that he no longer feared what they could do because now everything they did only made his case stronger, only made the truth louder, only made their fall harder. He walked back inside his home and sat in his quiet living room, letting the emotions of the last days finally settle in his chest. Anger, yes, but also heartbreak, because he had believed in this community, believed in the idea of neighbors watching out for each other, believed in shared peace, and knowing the HOA chose greed and cruelty over humanity hurt him more deeply than the trench ever could. But then he thought about the future, about the courtroom, about the moment he would stand before a judge and press play, showing the world exactly who these people were, what they had done, how they had abused every inch of their power, and he felt a strength rise inside him, a fire steady and bright. "You wanted to scare me," he whispered, voice steady. "But all you did was expose yourself." And as the house settled into quiet again, he understood something powerful. The HOA didn't realize it yet, but this chapter wasn't about their intimidation. It was about his awakening. Their attacks didn't break him, they forged him. And tomorrow, when the legal storm hit, they would finally understand that the homeowner they tried to bury was already standing miles above them, armed with truth, with evidence, with the law, and with a resolve so strong it echoed through every quiet room of his house. And as he closed his eyes that night, the last thought in his mind was simple, heavy, and true. They had no idea what was coming next. The next morning didn't just feel different. It felt charged, like the world around him knew something was shifting, like the air itself was holding its breath as he opened his eyes before the alarm, his mind already awake, his chest heavy but steady, his heart beating with a quiet strength that had been growing inside him with every moment the HOA tried to break him. He stepped outside to get the mail, expecting to see another violation taped to his door, but what he saw was worse. 3 HOA board members waiting at the edge of his driveway like vultures circling a wounded animal, except he wasn't wounded, not anymore, and the second they saw him walk out calmly, their confident posture cracked. The board president smoothed her shirt nervously, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes, and said in a sugary voice, "We need to speak with you about your violations." He didn't respond. He didn't slow down. He walked to his mailbox with a calmness that felt deliberate, powerful, like a message carved in silence, and the board members exchanged worried glances because they expected him to panic, to argue, to defend himself, but instead he ignored them completely, and that terrified them more than anger ever could. The president stepped in his path, voice tightening with desperation. "You've ignored multiple notices. We need to resolve this before we escalate." He looked at her with a calm expression that made her swallow hard, and in a quiet, steady voice he said, "You've already escalated." Then he walked past her and went back inside, leaving all 3 board members frozen in confusion and fear, and once the door closed behind him, he exhaled slowly because he knew what was coming next. They were going to panic, break rules, make mistakes, dig themselves deeper, and every second of it would be recorded by the cameras they didn't know existed. He watched from inside as they huddled together in his driveway, whispering in harsh voices, the vice president saying, "He's not scared. Something's wrong," and another board member muttering, "I told you we shouldn't have dug that trench." But the president snapped, "We're in control. He has no proof," her voice trembling with denial she couldn't hide. When they finally left, he sat at his desk and prepared the final documents the attorney had asked for. Organized files, labeled evidence clips, printed timestamps, every detail arranged perfectly, every piece pointing to the same truth. The HOA had crossed every legal line possible, and today the attorney would file the case formally. As he worked, emotion swelled inside him. Anger at how far they had gone, sadness at how much peace they had stolen from him, exhaustion from weeks of harassment, but also a rising strength, a confidence shaped by the truth sitting in front of him. When he finished, he placed the folder on the passenger seat of his truck and began driving to the attorney's office, the tension in his chest tight but not fearful. More like the tension before a decisive moment, the moment where everything changes. Halfway there, his phone buzzed with a text from his attorney. Judge-approved emergency hearing. HOA will be notified today. His grip tightened on the wheel, a shock of adrenaline rushing through him as he realized that they had no idea what was coming. They would be blindsided, unprepared, exposed. When he reached the attorney's office, the lawyer was already standing by the door, smiling with a sharpness that meant victory was close. They reviewed the final documents together, signed the official complaint, and within minutes, the case was filed. It was real now. It was happening. It was no longer a nightmare he was enduring alone. It was a legal battle the HOA could never win. On the way back home, his phone buzzed again. This time from the county inspector confirming the appointment to examine the trench and verify trespassing and property destruction. Everything was lining up. Everything was falling into place. As he pulled into the neighborhood, he saw something that made the fire inside him burn brighter. The entire HOA board was gathered on the sidewalk outside his home, pacing, panicking, waving papers, arguing loudly, unaware that he was watching quietly from inside his truck with a calm expression. Their faces were red with stress, their voices sharp with fear. Why did the county call us? Why did the lawyer send us a notice? What evidence does he have? He's lying, he has to be. What if he's not? And then the president, who had been confident for so long, finally cracked, shouting, "This is his fault. If he had just done what we asked." But the vice president cut her off with a harsh whisper. "We broke the law. You know we broke the law." Their fear tasted like justice. He stepped out of his truck, not rushing, not angry, simply calm, steady, walking toward his front door as they watched him with frantic eyes, their panic loud enough to shake the air. The president ran toward him, voice desperate. "We need to talk, right now." But he looked at her the way someone looks at a stranger. No fear, no respect, no emotion, and said, "No, you'll talk in court." Her mouth fell open. The vice president's face went pale. Another board member stumbled back like the words had physical weight. He walked inside, closed the door, and let silence settle around him again. Heavy but peaceful, powerful but calm. And then, the moment he had been waiting for, his phone buzzed with the message that changed everything. Judge granted temporary protection. HOA is now legally banned from contacting you or stepping on your property. Effective immediately. He stared at the message, letting the meaning sink deep, letting the relief wash through him, letting the victory settle into his bones. For the first time in weeks, his home felt safe. His breath felt steady. The weight on his chest felt lighter. He walked to the window and looked outside at the HOA members still arguing in the street, unaware that the battle they started had just turned into the fight they could never win. And as he watched them crumble under the pressure of their own schemes, he whispered to himself, "You thought you were burying me, but you were digging your own grave." And in that moment, he felt something powerful: freedom, justice, and the first real taste of victory. The next 48 hours moved like a storm he could feel but not see. A storm he knew he had triggered by choosing truth over fear, and as morning light spread across his quiet house, He woke with a heaviness in his chest. Not sadness, not fear, but the weight of final steps approaching, the weight of knowing that the HO, for the first time in years, was no longer the hunter but the hunted. He stood by his window with a cup of coffee, watching through the blinds as the HOA board members gathered in a frantic cluster across the street, pacing like cornered animals, whispering urgently, clutching folders, tapping on their phones with trembling fingers, their confidence replaced with panic, their authority replaced with fear, their arrogance swallowed by the reality settling over them like a dark cloud. They were no longer in control. And as he watched them, emotion stirred deeply inside him. Anger for everything they had done, yes, but also sadness that the community he once believed in was led by people who cared more about power than humanity. People who claimed to protect property values, while destroying trust. People who used their position to bully instead of support. And that sadness sat heavy in his chest because he never wanted war with his neighbors. He only wanted peace. But they dug the trench. They trespassed at night. They whispered threats behind fences. They mocked him when he did nothing wrong. And now they were finally facing consequences they thought would never apply to them. Around noon, a white county vehicle pulled up to his driveway, and the moment the HOA saw the inspector step out, their faces drained of color. They rushed toward him, shouting excuses, waving papers, throwing blame in every direction but their own. But the inspector raised a hand and said firmly, "I will speak to the homeowner first," and their voices died instantly. He stepped outside, calm and steady, and the inspector greeted him with professionalism in his eyes and curiosity in his tone, because he had already reviewed the emergency file the lawyer sent. Photos, timestamps, camera clips, the entire trench documented clearly. And as they walked the perimeter of the property, measuring the depth, inspecting the disturbed soil, matching boot prints to the photos the homeowner provided, the inspector's expression shifted from surprise to disbelief to anger, because even he, with decades of experience, had rarely seen such blatant abuse of authority. "They thought you wouldn't fight back," the inspector muttered quietly as he wrote notes, and he responded, "They thought wrong." And something about the simple calm in his voice made the inspector nod with a respect that didn't need words. When the inspection was complete, the inspector crossed the street to speak to the HOA board, and he watched from his window as the conversation unfolded like a collapsing building. The president tried to lie first, claiming the trench had always been there, then tried to blame him, saying he altered the land himself. But the inspector cut her off sharply, pointing to the photos, pointing to the timestamps, pointing to the footprints, and for the first time, the HOA's fake confidence shattered in public. Neighbors began stepping out of their homes, observing from porches and sidewalks, whispering to each other. Confusion spreading through the community like wildfire because they had never seen the board this shaken, this exposed, this powerless. Some whispered that they had seen the board outside his home late at night. Others whispered about strange noises in the early mornings. Some whispered that maybe, just maybe, the HOA wasn't the group of protectors they pretended to be. And as he watched all of it unfold, a deep emotional wave hit him. Relief that the truth was finally coming out, yes, but also a quiet sorrow that so many people in the neighborhood had been living under fear without even realizing it. Fear of fines, fear of retaliation, fear of speaking up, fear that if they ever challenged the board, they would become the next target. When the inspector finally left, delivering a short but devastating statement, "This is going to court." Immediately, the HOA board looked like ghosts standing under the sun, pale, shaking, desperate, pretending to stay strong but crumbling with every breath they took. He went back inside and sat down at his dining table, letting the silence wrap around him again, letting the weight of everything sink deeper because he knew today was not the end. Today was the breaking point, the moment everything cracked wide open. He thought about the trench again, about standing outside that morning with confusion twisting in his stomach, about the way his hands shook when he first saw the dirt, about the cold smirks on the board members' faces, about the sense of betrayal stabbing him like a blade, and he felt his throat tighten because he had carried all that alone. He carried it quietly while pretending to be fine. He swallowed every fear and every memory of those long nights listening to whispers outside his fence. But now he wasn't alone. Now the law stood beside him. Now the county stood beside him. Now the truth stood beside him. As evening approached, he stepped onto his porch, watching the sun dip behind the roofs, turning the sky orange as the street fell into a tense quiet, the kind of quiet that comes after a storm but before the final lightning strike. The HOA members sat in their driveways, heads in their hands, their phones ringing non-stop, their conversations frantic. And as he stood there, a deep, emotional thought washed over him. He didn't want revenge for pain. He wanted justice for peace. He didn't want to destroy them. He wanted to protect everyone they would have hurt next. He breathed deeply, letting the cool air fill his lungs and steady the fire inside him, and whispered softly to himself, "You dug a trench to trap me, but you only trapped yourselves." And that night, as he locked his doors and turned off the lights, he felt something he hadn't felt since the very beginning. Safety. The story wasn't over. Court was coming, and the HOA had no idea how much worse it was about to get.